Hey everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this koala bear illustration. And I'm trying to do it in this style of Iraville, and she's a really talented German illustrator. And after you watch this video, if you like this style, I recommend going over to her portfolio website because I think you'll find it really inspiring. So I've got a watercolor paper texture already loaded into Procreate, and I'm using the St. Petersburg texture. And for the brushes, I think I can do all of this with the regular watercolor brush kit. And I'll put links to all of these materials in the description below. Now I've pasted in this sketch as the very top layer, and you can have this sketch for free. I'll put a download link in the description, along with another sketch that has more koalas, a little bit more going on. I decided not to use that one for this video just because I think it would be like an hour-long tutorial. So for this video, we're just gonna do this scene. Now I've pasted the sketch up here, but also I wanna make sure I set the transparency to multiply, and that'll prevent it from covering up our artwork as we paint. And also I'll lower the transparency just so I can barely see that. And I'll start painting by selecting a layer underneath the paper texture, just like you normally would. Now I'm gonna start out with the abstract round brush, and I'm gonna choose a kind of medium bluish gray color. And at a pretty big size, I'll just loosely fill out the silhouette of the koala bears, but I'm gonna use a lot of strokes like this because I want it to be pretty blotchy and interesting. And after I've filled that out, I'm gonna go over it with the water blender, maybe around 20%, and just break this up a little bit, but I'm gonna try to leave a lot of kind of artifacts behind because the koala bear can be pretty smooth, and I don't want it to be too boring. So there we go, that looks really good. It's nice and blotchy, and this is really suitable for koala bears because they do have that kind of texture in their fur. Now after that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I'm going to set that to the fine liner pen. And then at a pretty small size, maybe around 10%, I'm just going to go along the edge of the sketch and basically cut out this wash that we made. Now after that, I need to separate the silhouette of the koalas from the extra watercolor around the edges. So just to save time, I'm going to do it with the selection tool set to automatic. And I'll make an automatic selection that just fills out the silhouette of the bodies of the koala bears. And as I slide it, it kind of adjusts the threshold. So I'm going to make sure I set it to a point where it totally fills it out. I think that'll work. Then I'll do copy and paste. Now it just cut out that selection and then pasted it on a layer above. And I can see that in the layers panel. So here's the original layer, and when I turn that off, I'm just left with the selection, which is exactly the shape that we want. Now if I deselect it here and zoom in, you can see I have made a couple of mistakes. So I'm going to use the water blender to fix that. So just small enough to fit in there, I'll just kind of pull out that edge to hide that. Then I'll go back in there with the eraser brush and just kind of re-erase it to fit the sketch. Next, I need to add some shadows and highlights to kind of give this some dimensionality, and I'm going to do that with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll start with the ears, and I'll make a selection that just highlights the ears like this. And since I can do both at the same time, I'll just circle around and do the other ear too, just like that. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten those just so they stand off from the head. And I'm going to do the same thing to the baby one down here. After that, I'm going to give the faces a highlight. Now I can see my sketch is just showing through there, and I'm going to use that to kind of guide this selection. So I'm going to grab the selection tool again, set to freehand, and I'll make this kind of horseshoe shaped selection like this that just goes around each eye and then below the mouth there. I'll feather this one out, maybe 20%, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it. And I'll do the same thing to the baby. Next, I need to do the neck shadows. So I'll just make a selection like this, just under the chin. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken that one. Next, I want to add some more highlights and shadows to kind of bring out the arms and the legs. And the first thing I recommend doing is actually making a large shadow kind of on the tummy area. And I'll do them both at the same time here. So I've got those two selections. I'll feather them out. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and then I'll darken it. And that's just the first step. Then I'll go in there again, and then I can kind of see the outline of this arm, for example. I'll just make a selection that basically follows that one. Then I'll just circle back, hue, saturation, and brightness, and then I'll just brighten it. The reason I did that shadow first is because it's going to make these stand out a lot more. And I'm just going to go through and use the freehand selection tool and do all the arms and legs like this. Next, I need to add a shadow that kind of separates the baby. So I'm going to zoom in there, and using the selection tool again, I'll just make a selection along this. Then I'll go to add to sort of continue it down here. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it. Now after that, I need to use the water blender to kind of fade some of these highlights and shadows. So I'm going to grab the water blender, and pretty small, maybe around 10%. I'll start with this part as an example, but see this kind of boundary? I'll just mix that up and fade them together. And this will sort of make it look like more of a kind of continuous surface. And I'm going to go through and do all the arms and legs using this same technique. I think I can leave the leg like this. I don't need to blur that one at all. Now this shadow here, I think it does look a little bit harsh, so I will try to soften the edge there. So there we go, that's looking really good. I think now I'm just going to move on and do the faces. And those are going to be on a separate layer, so I'll make a new layer. And I'm going to grab the fine liner pen. And then using pure white, I'll just fill out the eyes really quickly. Then after that, I'm going to select black. And maybe I'm going to change the size to be a little bit smaller. And first, I'll just add a kind of line on the very top of the eye like this. And I'm trying to make it so it starts as like a taper, gets thicker, and then tapers again. And I'm going to do the same thing to all the eyes. Now after that, I can fill out the pupils here, but I'm not going to use the same dark color for that. I'm going to lighten it up just a little bit, and then I'm going to use the same fine liner pen and just fill those out real quick. And if you want to save time, you can just drag the color to fill it after you've sort of done the outline. But it does leave this kind of light line, so you have to go over it again and cover that one up. Now while I've got the fine liner pen and this dark color selected, I can quickly fill out the mouth details here. And then once that's done, I can do the nose. And the nose is so easy. I'm going to use a kind of bluish color, but it's going to be mostly gray, kind of a medium blue-gray color like that. And I'll fill out the nose. Now after that, I need to add a highlight. So I'm going to grab the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll make a selection around each one like that, like kind of an oval shape. Then I'll feather it out. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness. And when I brighten it, it makes it look a little bit three-dimensional. Now for the kind of nostrils, I guess, it's really simple. I'm going to use the freehand selection tool again and just make these kind of arc shapes like this. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness and then brighten them this time. Now if you want, you can add the eyebrows, and they're really faint, so I'm going to use a pretty medium gray color. I don't want them to jump out too much, so we'll see how that looks. I think that's a pretty good shade. I think if I do them in pure black, they're just a little bit too strong. Now the faces are done, and just to keep the layers to a minimum here, I think it's also a good idea to kind of create the space for these leaves. So I'm just going to select a pretty light color, and then using the same fine liner pen, I'll just kind of etch out a space for these leaves, because later on a separate layer above this, I'll paint some green to fill these out. So there we go, these koalas are almost done. I just need to kind of do an outline. And usually I just do like a darker outline, but I want to give these the impression that they're kind of fuzzy. So there's a different technique I've never covered before, and I'll do my best to explain that here. So the first thing you got to do is a regular dark outline. So I'm going to make a new layer and select a pretty dark gray color. I'm going to use the same fine liner pen, but a really, really small size. And I'm just going to go in there in just a few areas. Wherever I think it needs it, I'll just draw a line. And this is just to sort of generate contrast. And after this is done, I'll show you how to make it look fuzzy. So there we go, that's it for the dark outline. And I did it pretty sparingly. I didn't do it around every single edge basically, and it is broken in a lot of areas. And this is just a stylistic choice, and I really like the way that looks. Now while I was doing that, I did notice a mistake that I made earlier. And basically I just totally forgot about the foot of the mama koala. So I'm gonna fix that real quick. So I'm gonna go back to the layer here that has the silhouette of the koala. And then using the selection tool, I'll just select up here like this. And then I'll lighten that. And that'll make it stand up just enough so that it kind of makes sense there. And again, I'm gonna go back to the outline layer, and I'm just gonna continue the outline on this extra foot. Now after that, I can move on and do the fuzzy outline. So I'll make that on another layer just above those. And I'll select a lighter gray color, I think something like that. And I'll use the same fine liner pen, but at a larger size than I did the outlines with. And I'll start with the ear as an example. I'm just gonna use that and go around the edge of the ear like this. And I'll do the same thing to the baby. Now once that's done, I'm gonna go over it again, but this time with a slightly darker gray, slightly smaller size, in a lot more kind of sparingly, I guess. So I'll just do a few lines like this. And then as a kind of finishing touch, I'm gonna grab the water blender brush, maybe around 20%, and I'm just gonna kind of blur the inside very, very, very carefully. So these koalas are almost done. Next, I just want to merge all the koala layers together onto one layer, just to keep this a little bit organized. And in this case, I think the ears ended up being a little bit kind of boring. So I just want to show you kind of an optional technique. First, I'll turn off the sketch. And if I zoom in on the ear, you can see it's pretty plain. You might want to leave it this way, but if you want to, you can use the selection tool set to freehand and just make a selection like this. Then if you go to the hue, saturation, and brightness, you can lighten it a little bit. And it just adds a nice touch on the ears. So I like the way that looks. So I'm going to go through and do that to all the ears. So there we go. The koalas are totally done. So for now, I'll turn on the sketch and I'll turn off the koala bears just so we can focus on some of the other elements. And next, I'll start with the tree, so I'm going to make a new layer for that. And the tree is really simple. I'm just going to use a kind of gray khaki color like this. Then I'm going to grab the abstract round brush, but usually where I use this at a larger size, for this case, I'm going to use it quite small and just quickly fill out this tree. And after that, you can see where the brush strokes are overlapping. And I'm gonna fix that with the water blender, but at a really, really tiny size. And next, to add some detail to this, I'm gonna use the same brown color, but I'm gonna use the fine liner pen. And just because it's the pen, it's gonna show up slightly darker. So at a really small size, I'm just gonna go through and add some line details to each of the branches. After that, I can do the leaves, and I'll do those on the same layer, and I'll just select a kind of green color to start with. But as I paint the leaves, I'm going to shift the green color slightly so all the leaves don't end up being exactly the same color. And I think for the brush, I'll use the fine liner pen, but at a small size, and I'm going to do them not stroke based at all. I'm going to do the leaves basically filling them out manually like this, and then dropping the color in. And I'm going to do each leaf just in a slightly different shade of green. So I filled all the leaves in, including these ones over here. And next, I'm going to make another layer above that. And I'm going to choose a very light yellowish color. And then using the same brush I did, I'm just going to add a kind of center line to each one like this. There we go. And if you want to, you can lower the transparency of that one and just set it to a point where those lines just barely show up, but maybe they're not too overstated. I think that looks pretty good. So I'll merge those layers together just so the tree and the leaves are just on one layer. Next, I'm going to move on and do the bird really quickly, but I'm not going to do it step by step because it's pretty simple. I think I'll just fast forward through this part to save time, but I'm going to do the whole bird with the fine liner pen, and then basically different shades of yellow. So that's it for the bird. It's really simple. And then after that, I just filled in those hearts. Now with the bird done and all the rest of the elements done, I'm going to turn everything on. I'll turn off the sketch though. So there we go. All of our elements are visible. And now we can deal with some of the transparency issues. So right away, if I zoom in here, there's definitely an issue here. I think the easiest way to solve that is to just erase the tree. So I'll select the tree layer, grab the eraser brush, and then just kind of cut it back a little bit. Now one more issue that I noticed is the bird's foot kind of loses contrast on the head. So what I'm going to do is fix that by first selecting the bird layer. Then I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll make a selection just around the bottom of the foot and I'll feather it out. Then I'll just go to my hue, saturation, and brightness and just brighten it a little bit. And I'm going to do the opposite to the top of the head of the koala bear, so I'll select that layer. Same selection tool, make a circle a little bit bigger I guess, feather it out quite a bit. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it a little bit. And that's going to help that foot stand off. And there we go, this one is all done, and here's what it looks like when I print it out. Now in this video, I'm trying to follow the iraville technique, but she doesn't have a lot of examples of like furry creatures like koala bears, so I had to make some assumptions. But while I was playing around with the sketches, I did discover a couple of things kind of unique to her technique that might help you if you want to paint in a similar style. So one thing is the eyes. Usually they're very almond shaped, and then the pupil covers more than 50% of the whole eye, so it's a pretty big pupil. And then also there's only a black line on the top of the eye. It's very rare to see it on the bottom. Now I didn't do it in this video, but another thing she does a lot is add a kind of shadow underneath the eye. And I don't think it suits the koala bear very much. It makes them look kind of sad, I guess, but she does that in a lot, and in some situations it works out really nicely. Another thing I discovered is most of her illustrations of animals don't have any necks. And I never noticed this until I was studying again and again why my koalas didn't look right, kind of comparing them to any kind of similar illustration that she had. And that's what I found out. She almost never does any necks. Even the birds, the neck is just like an extension of the torso or something like that. So doing the koala bears this way was really critical to getting it in her style. And the last thing I discovered about the iraville style is how she handles the expressions of the different characters. They're almost never happy. They always have this kind of medium to almost a negative expression on their faces. And I think this works out really nicely because this illustration style is almost childish, but by combining it with some kind of sour expressions, it really has a nice contrast and it really fits well together. And that pretty much wraps it up. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. And other than that, guys, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.